So it is our first online stars. As you know, the stars have been going on once a month. They started in 2006, and they are specific presentations for science support staff. Before we begin, we acknowledge where we are located. McGill is located on traditional land of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. McGill honors, respects, and acknowledges these nations as the traditional custodians of the lands and waters on which we meet, which we exchange information and understanding, and where we live now. We are meeting, living, eating, working, playing together on this land and connecting with each other as best we can. Today, our speaker is presenting from her desk. That's in the McGill Rare Books and Special Collections area of McLennan. And this is on the 4th floor of the library. Normally, we would have been able to go to this site in person. And in fact, last October, Lauren and Mary Earle gave the stars a really wonderful lunch hour presentation on site. They spread out a beautiful selection of artifacts, of books, of manuscripts, and they spread them out on a massive big table right in very close to where Lauren is right now. And that was such a terrific introduction to the holdings, some of the holdings. And I think they particularly emphasized holdings that had to do with natural science or animals, plants, that kind of thing. And it was after that presentation that a few of the participants, there were about 23 people who attended, they asked specifically, they said to me, called me or emailed me afterwards and said they really enjoyed learning about this material, and could they have a recap or a part 2 or more insight into rare books collections. So I contacted Lauren at that time, and she said she agreed, and she said she would specifically like to focus on manuscripts. And we actually did schedule her talk for this date way back, I think about a year ago, maybe. And then she agreed to do it online, to do it virtually. And she's using some amazing imaging tools, equipment that she has. So you'll actually be able to see these items that she's selected, these 3-dimensional items, in a probably a much more visually exciting way than if we had been there in person on site. I'm saying that with confidence because we had a technical run through, and I was really, really blown away. So I'm just getting you ready. The excitement is to come before Lauren begins. She will be introduced by Christopher Lyons. He is the director of Rare Books and Special Collections, or what they call head librarian. Chris, please introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Ingrid, and welcome everyone. Good afternoon. You know, it's interesting. McGill has a lot of hidden treasures, and some of them are objects and some of them are people. And you're going to see both today. You know, McGill has wonderful, wonderful, wonderful collections. And as you heard, in medicine, that's Mary Earle's area of the Osler Library of the History of Medicine, and natural history and related areas in science, which is perhaps lesser known, but a really, really spectacular. The term world class is overused, but in this case, I really can say a world class collection. But collections are inert. Without the people to curate them, to teach about them, to write about them, to study them, and to build them, they might as well be buried in a basement or an attic or not there at all. So we're extremely fortunate in that you get to meet one of our stars today, which is Lauren Williams, who is a curator of a number of interesting collections. There's a Blacker Wood Natural History collection, which in itself is, ornithologically speaking, in other areas, one of the best, again, in the world, but also other areas in science as well, such as the William Dawson pamphlet collection, and material that deals with geology in that wonderful collection of 19th century material. She's also responsible for collections in maps and the MacDonald College rare material, which is agricultural and related, entomological, because of the Lyman Museum and interest there. But she also has a couple of other hats she wears. She's also responsible for women's studies, literature and theater programs, just because we thought she didn't have enough to do to fill a day. So we said, well, we got to give her some other work, or she's just going to be sitting around twiddling her thumbs, her green thumbs, perhaps, if you'll forgive a really bad pun. And I'm glad none of you turned your left at that point. That shows that you're a good audience. She's also interested in things related to printing. So she is also a trained printer, not meaning like she passed grade 1, not that kind of printing. The printing with printing presses, because we have a book arts lab as well, and it has an operating 200-year-old printing press. It celebrates its bicentenary the same year that McGill does, which is next year. And we have other printing press and requiring more and more type and setting up to do workshops with students. And Lauren has been instrumental in this because they say those who can't do teach. Well, she can do and can teach. So we're, again, extremely fortunate. So that gives you a sense of some of her Renaissance abilities. She's, in addition to being curator of a collection, or I could say as part of her roles as curator of the collections, she has been writing in the areas of natural history and printing and publication. She's got an upcoming chapter in a book on Casey Wood, coming out McGill Queen's University Press. She's also the project lead on the Virtual Museum of Canada's New Homes, New Ways, Women's Experience of Changing Environments. So she is very active in that, and she's a co-PI with Victoria Dickinson on the Gwillem project, Women Networks of Knowledge and Exchange in the company Raj. So as you could see, a great depth as well as breadth, and we're really fortunate to have her here at McGill, and we're really fortunate to have her share some of her knowledge, her vast knowledge with us today. So I will toss it to you, Lauren.
Thanks very much, Chris, for that really kind introduction. So as Ingrid mentioned, I was honored to be asked to give a tour to the STARS group last year. And basically we focused on the evolution of the history of science from the medieval period up to the 20th century. And as we went around the room, the most frequent questions we got were sort of, how is this book made? And how would they have made this kind of illustration, and so on. And so that's what Ingrid has asked me to focus on this time around. And so I've really made an effort again to focus on science books, except for the medieval manuscripts we're going to look at. Unfortunately, we don't have, or at least the science related examples we have aren't as interesting to look at as the ones that I'll show you. But otherwise, I've chosen some examples from our history of science collections to show you. And I'm really glad to do this because I think that a lot of modern scientists at McGill are not aware that we have these really rich history of science collections at McGill and in rare books, because I think people often associate rare books with the humanities. So if you have any questions for me about other history of science materials after this talk, please feel free to let me know. And also, I forgot to welcome you virtually to Rare Books. As you know, I'm sure the building is closed at the moment, for browsing and for borrowing books, but we are still very much operational. We are offering a digitization on demand service. So if anyone is interested in a book, we'll actually scan the whole thing for you and then send you a link to it. So we are very much not closed for research, just closed for in-person visits at the moment. So I'm just going to share my screen with you so that you can see what I'm looking at. Can everyone see this? Can I get a thumbs up from anyone? Fergus, I can see you. Okay, great.
Yeah,
so,
you can see it.
Okay, great. Wonderful. So also, as Ingrid mentioned, please feel free at any point. I'm going to sort of yammer on about all these various things that I'm going to show you, but at any point, if you have any questions, please feel free to jump in. Or if you don't feel like speaking out loud, you're welcome to put a question in the chat, and Fergus has agreed to keep an eye on the chat and to let me know if you have any questions. Because really the nice thing about doing a presentation this way rather than pre-recording it, is that we can still keep some interaction involved. So please feel free to ask me anything you like. So as you can see, this is live. We've got this beautiful leaf from a medieval manuscript here to show you. This particular leaf is from a missal, which is basically a chant or a hymn book, which is used in the liturgical sort of celebration of the Eucharist in the Catholic Church. And this particular leaf from a manuscript was created in the 14th century somewhere in northern Italy, but that's about all we know about it. As you can see, the written language is in Latin, and it's a musical score. So these are actually musical notes that are meant for a choir to read when they're performing the Mass. So one of the reasons why this is such a, here's my arm for scale. One of the reasons why this is such a large book is because it would have been actually displayed at the front of the altar. And so people from quite a distance away would still be able to read the music and be able to sing along. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with medieval manuscripts and then work my way up through the rest of history and give you a sense of how these books were made. And in particular, we'll focus also a bit on different illustration techniques, because I know that people were really interested in that last time around. So I'll explain all these various things for you. So
can I interrupt right away? I'm so excited about this camera. If this intrudes on your narrative, just ignore me. But I would love it if you could do what you did yesterday and pop that camera, zoom it into that gold leaf. That
Sure.
part of it is so exciting for me. It sends a shiver up my spine to see that and to know that that was made over 500 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And for some reason now, this has frozen for me. Uh-oh.
Oh, did I cause that?
It shouldn't. I'm just going to quit this and try to restart the program again and see if that helps. One sec.
My apologies, everybody. I feel somehow responsible for
No
doing
problem, no problem. It's absolutely not your fault. We're still working out the kinks with this. Okay, now it's working for me, and now I will share my screen again. Okay.
Oh,
Are
look at that.
you able to see it again?
Yes.
You can see it zooming in and out.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so interested in the materials and where they got the tinctures and the dyes. Anyway, you go ahead.
Okay. Well, I will get to the illumination because that's one of the best parts. But I feel like we have to start with what this is all sitting on, which is parchment here. So I'm sure a lot of you have probably heard the word parchment bandied about before. And this is sort of a catch-all term for any kind of animal skin. So often cows were used to create parchment sheets for bookmaking, but you also will often see goat skin, sheep skin, pig skin, all different kinds of animals. I'm sure you've also probably heard the term vellum used before, and vellum refers specifically to veal. So if you want a really, really nice, soft, supple page, unfortunately, using a younger animal is usually the way to accomplish this. So when you're talking about vellum, you're talking about a baby cow. But really, without a chemical test, it's hard to tell what kind of animal is used, even between vellum and cow. Sometimes you just can't tell. So generally, it's safer to just refer to these pages as parchment because we know they're all animal skin. And so I have always found the way that they make parchment to be particularly impressive and a bit horrifying. So I'll explain that to you as well. So generally you would start with your animal, you skin the animal. Usually the sheets are made from the torso of the animal because the skin that gets much rougher around the neck and around the joints where the arms meet the shoulders and so on. So it's usually the torso that they would use. You would also have to really closely inspect the skin that you wanted to use to make sure that the animal didn't have any cuts or insect bites or anything, because once you prepare the sheet and stretch it out to be used, those tiny little holes can actually become really large holes. And as you can imagine, it would be very expensive to kill a whole bunch of animals in order to use them to make a book. So you really wanted to make sure that you'd be able to use all of the skin that you were preparing. Although people in the medieval period really did make an effort to use every possible scrap. And sometimes you even see a big hole in the middle of a manuscript page, but then some colorful stitching or other interesting ways of patching up the hole so that they can still use the page even though it has a hole in it. So anyway, they would skin the animal, and then they would put the skin with the flesh still attached into a water bath that was usually for at least a day or two. And the flesh would start to rot and would start to come away from the skin, and the hair would start to fall out. And then they would move the whole skin into a second bath, which was mixed with lime, as in Lyme. And that acid would start to eat away at the flesh of the animal, leaving just the skin behind. And so they would have to stir these rotting animal skins in this big vat of lime for about 7 to 10 days as it ate away at the flesh. And then finally they would remove it from the lime bath and put it back into some running cool water so to wash that all off and to stop the lime from continuing to degrade the skin. And then they would stretch the animal skin over a big curved wooden shield, looks like a big shield. And the idea is that there would be no sharp edges all the way around to catch the skin on and to cause any more holes in it. And after it's over the shield, they would use a really big curved knife called a lunellum to slowly scrape away at the skin, because the idea is to get the skin as thin as possible so that it actually works as a nice page. Because if you've got a big fat skin, you can't have many pages in your book, or else you would have a really massive book. So it was an incredibly laborious process, an incredibly stinky and toxic process for these people who had to actually prepare the animal skins to be used. And I think it also gives you a sense of how really it was only institutions like the church that would be able to afford to create manuscripts at this time, because normal people wouldn't want to start killing off the few pieces of livestock that they had in order to create books. So at this point, really the only people who owned books, who made books, and who were literate were involved with the church in some way. So also, the way that you would make the ink is very interesting. We often get questions about how ink is made. And I don't know if you are familiar with what an oak gall is, but these are sort of circular spherical formations that form when certain wasps lay their eggs in the buds of an oak tree. And as the larvae grow, they create this big ball looking thing, and they grow and develop inside. But if you were to crack open one of these gall balls, you would find a really black, chalky substance on the inside. And so people in the medieval period would boil these oak galls, and then they would mix that with the soot that forms on the inside of a lantern, when you're burning a candle, or with charcoal. And then the combination of those ingredients would make a very, very fine and very organic black ink. And so that is super common. We see that kind of ink in a lot of medieval manuscripts. The other main kind of ink you would find is a non-organic substance, basically where you would mix oak gall with iron shavings. And then the chemical reaction between the iron and the oak gall actually creates sort of a more metallic looking black ink. And that is quite corrosive because the iron rusts. And so you can actually see when that sort of an ink has been used on a medieval manuscript, because it starts to actually eat right through the parchment page and create holes. So luckily it doesn't look like that was used on this manuscript, because the ink is not eaten through. And so now, having explained that, we can move on to the illumination. And so one of the really cool things about illuminated manuscripts is the way in which they really needed to be planned out. So if it was me making this sheet, I would probably put all of my musical notation down first and leave a space at the end for this illumination. But in fact, they did it in the opposite way, because when you've got gold leaf in an illumination, the way that you would make it shine is by burnishing it. So they would take a burnisher, which basically is an implement that looks like a pen with a flat end on the end. And once you've laid your gold leaf down onto the illustration, you have to rub it a lot in order to get it to shine. And so you can imagine that if you already have text on your page, you sort of have to put your hand over top of the text in order to do your burnishing, and that would cause the text to smudge. And so you don't want that, obviously. So in all medieval manuscripts, they would actually plan out their page and put any illuminations down first. And then they would fill in the rest of the page with text and with whatever else they were going to put on. So there was a lot of planning, sort of, I would almost call it graphic design type planning about how you want your page to look from the beginning. And Ingrid was mentioning the different pigments that people would use. I'll zoom in a little bit closer on this wonderful initial. They really had all different kinds of ways of making colors in the medieval period, basically using different kinds of minerals to achieve these colors. So for blue, they would use things like lapis lazuli or malachite or azurite in order to create, that really bright blue color. For red, they would use things like vermilion or Brazil wood or toasted lead or even mercury to create the color red. For yellow, they would use things like egg yolks or the stamen of the crocus plant flower to create yellow. They would use verdigris for green. You could teach an entire class on how they mixed pigment in the medieval period. So I won't spend too much time on that. But there are actually recipe books from the medieval period that you can still look at today, where they've actually translated the recipes, and they have, it's a bit frustrating when you try to recreate these recipes because it's not like, 2 teaspoons of verdigris to create green. They say things like add a goodly amount of verdigris, and then mix for, say, 3 Hail Marys as you're mixing this, that sort of thing. But you can still access those recipe books now. And so it's interesting to see the process that went into mixing these kinds of colors. And also, finally, I'll just mention that, as you can see, this is a letter. And usually they would create these illuminated initials to start sentences in medieval manuscripts. And so there's a whole branch of the study of book history that just focuses on initials. And so people talk about different kinds of initials. There are inhabited initials, which means that sometimes you'll see a little illustration of people in there doing something. There are floriated initials, which this is one, that means that there's some sort of floral pattern going on inside the initial. And there are also historiated initials, in which there is actually a story playing out within the initial. So that's a whole other rabbit hole you could go down that I just wanted to mention. But the biggest development comes when we get to printing. And so I'm going to move on to printing, but before I move this manuscript out from underneath the camera, would anyone like to ask any questions about it?
I have one question. The letter that is immediately to the right of the illuminated letter has a whole bunch of little bits around it. Is that just decorative, or does it have some other purpose?
As far as I know, it's just decorative. You see this very, very often in medieval manuscripts. In addition to decorating initials in this way, you see a lot of this. Actually, I have one other example here that I can show you. Let's swap these out. So as you can see here, there are many more initials like the one that you pointed out. And they are all sort of elaborated with pen work in order to emphasize the beginning of a new sentence. One interesting thing to note is that in Latin, especially in classical Latin, they did not have punctuation. There were no periods. There were nothing to indicate the beginning and the end of a sentence. And so in classical Latin, you just have text running on and on and on, but because of the way that Latin is formed, the ending of the word tells you if it's the subject or the object of the sentence, and so forth. By the time we get to the medieval period, they have started to add in punctuation. The language has evolved quite a bit. But as you can see, we haven't gotten to the point where we're making paragraph breaks and other things that we see in the modern day. So they did start to understand that your eye needs a break or some way of identifying where one sentence ends and the next begins, or a way to emphasize a certain passage. And so my understanding is that that's where these initials started to come in as a way of drawing the reader's attention to a certain passage, or to end and begin a sentence.
Thanks.
Lauren, I
Also
have a
a
question.
burnisher.
May I pose my question? I'll put my video on. So I'm one, as the person, the calligrapher, do you know by any chance what the practice was? Would you do all the illuminations first? Would you outline your page, do the main text, or is there any insight into that?
Yeah, you would definitely do the illuminations first, as I mentioned, because you don't want to smudge your text while you're creating the illumination. So those would go on first. There's a lot of also complex sort of mise en page, as they say, that goes into designing a medieval manuscript page. They already saw the value of margins, obviously. It's nice for the eye, I think, to have a break and to see some white space happening around text. So that factors in quite heavily into medieval manuscript layout. They would also, in order to line the page and make sure that all of the text is uniformly laid out, they had various ways of doing this. My favorite is one called a star wheel, which basically looks like a pizza cutter, like a big rotating circle on a handle that you would sort of roll all the way across the page, and the circle has spikes on the end of it at regular intervals. So basically, as you roll the wheel along the page, it will puncture at regular intervals holes all the way along. And then they would do that on both sides of the page and then run a knife all the way across to join up the holes, and that would create the lining on the page. So there was they did spend quite a lot of time considering what the page was going to look like, laying it out, and making sure that it was all evenly proportioned and so on before they would even put any ink or anything on the page.
Thanks. And one of our comments is that the margins were also used for commentaries, I think.
Yes, certainly. I can't see the chat for some reason, so please.
We'll monitor it.
Yeah, there is one more question in the chat about the musical score that you had, Lauren. It was to do with the timing of the music, and Susan asked, did they have no way of specifying half notes, quarter notes, etc.?
To be honest, I don't know a lot about medieval music notation, but there are people at McGill who can read this music, and I can't tell you whether, I'm pretty sure that there was some way of indicating musical timing, but I wouldn't be able to tell you how. But we actually had an event last year or the year before where a choir was assembled to sing from one of our medieval musical works. It's called an antiphonal. And it was just beautiful to hear them sing the chant from it. But I believe it was a professor in the music department here at McGill who was in.
It was Julia Cummings.
Okay, thank you, Chris.
Who did it, and they did have notations. It's different from modern notation. So they were able to read the time, and it evolved over the Middle Ages too. So there's not one notation for the period.
Yeah, and from what I understand, it's a different scale of notes as well. And also their musical staffs are different. They only have 4 lines instead of 5 and so on. So there's quite a few interesting differences studying the medieval music versus modern music.
Thank you.
Okay, so now let's move on to printing, because this really is a significant development. Does anyone happen to know when printing was invented? Feel free to just jump in and give me your best guess.
Mid 1500s?
Very close. 1400s. And does anyone know the name of the guy who is credited with inventing printing?
Was it Gutenberg?
Yes. Excellent. You're all book historians.
Yeah.
And one thing that I like to make sure that people understand is that Gutenberg actually did not invent the printing press, which is something that I hear said a lot, which is unfortunately incorrect. He invented movable type. So the press as an idea, it already existed around 1450, because it was used to make wine, olive oil for pressing grapes and pressing olives and things like that. So he saw that and realized that it could be used to exert pressure on anything. And then he was the one who came up with the idea to cast individual pieces of type in metal, in lead, and then to use those for printing. So that's actually what he did. And I'm just going to show you an example of an early printed book. So this book is called the Buch der Natur. It's a German natural history encyclopedia. And it is actually a copy of a manuscript that was written in the 13th century. So it's still a fairly medieval work. But it was copied and copied many times as it was passed down along the generations. And then finally in 1478, somebody decided to print it. And one of the reasons why this book is particularly special for natural history and for the Black and Wood collection, which I'm responsible for, is that as far as we know, it contains the earliest printed illustrations of animals in the Western world, which is pretty cool. So while these birds are not exactly detailed scientific drawings, they were the first time that somebody decided to put this down in printed writing. But one thing that I like to emphasize is if you look at this book next to one of these medieval manuscript pages, it does not really look that different. The text looks very similar. We've got the same kind of large initial to start off the page. A lot of the sort of embellishments are quite similar. Even the colors that are used are quite similar. So when printing was invented, they really weren't reinventing the wheel. They were really just looking for a more efficient way of producing books. And while in retrospect, we know that the invention of the printing press was a huge revolution in terms of the spread of knowledge, the spread of literacy, and so on. At the time, no one really realized, I think, that, that it was such a massive development. So as you can see here, while these look like the medieval manuscript letters, these are actually, each letter on this page was printed using a piece of metal type. And I will show you the way that this is done. Hopefully you can see, actually, I'm just going to cover this for a second, but we'll come back to it because I don't want to get it dirty. This is what's called a composing stick. If it will focus on here. I can't see that very well. Can you see that? Is it having trouble focusing on this?
Yeah, it's a little blurry.
Maybe I'll just leave it. Okay.
Oh no, it's coming. Yeah.
So basically, if you were going to set a page in type, hopefully you can see that each one of these letters is an individual piece. I'll wiggle them around a little bit. So each one of these letters would be laid out in a big drawer, and there would be a little compartment for each letter. And people called compositors would stand in front of these drawers and basically would pull out the letters and put them into this thing, which is called a composing stick. Oh, sorry that it keeps refocusing. I hope nobody has vertigo or anything. And so you would lay all of the pieces of type in a row. You would add spacing material in between words in order to create blank spaces. And then once you've completed one row, you would start on the next one and so forth. So you would basically have to set, every single line on a page by hand. And then you would put it into a galley. And I'm going to see if this works. Yeah. Just move this for a second. So as you can see here, there are many lines of type. I'm just going to keep my hand out of there because it seems to not like that. So there are many lines of typeset row after row. And I'll just show you that this is what was printed from this piece of type. It's actually an excerpt from Moby Dick. So you can see that the little, this is a little engraving of a rose here. It's transferred onto this. So basically, the piece of paper would go over the type like this, and then pressure would be exerted from the top, and then it creates the mirror image on the page, basically like a big stamp. So any questions about the sort of printing process while I'm on this topic?
So I'm guessing all the typeset, all these little individual pieces of lead had to be kind of put in reverse order.
Yes, so they're all set upside down and backwards, which can be a little bit confusing. But once you sort of get started, it becomes easier and easier to think about text in that way. I can try to show you this. Hopefully, the camera agrees with me. As you're setting the type, can you see that there's a line that runs all the way down the row of pieces right here? Yeah. That is actually a little nick that sits on the side of the body of each piece of type. And so as you're putting the pieces of type into the stick, you actually hold the stick like this and you run your thumb along that line. And that line indicates which way up and which way is up and which way is down on each piece of type. So without having to think about it too much, you can make sure that every single letter is set the right way around, which is particularly helpful when you think about letters like P's and Q's or B's and D's, which, you know, when you just look at it quickly, you can't really tell which way around it's supposed to go, which is actually where the saying, mind your P's and Q's comes from, so that you don't set it upside down. There are a lot of really, really interesting modern sayings that come from printing, which I love to tell people. For instance, all of the capital letters would be in one drawer, and all of the minuscule or lowercase letters would be in another drawer. And on a compositor's stand, there's a slanted part that is up high, and then another slanted part that is down low. And those are called the upper and the lower parts of the case. And so that's actually where upper and lowercase letters came from, because you would stick the whole drawer either on the upper part or the lower part in order to start setting the pieces of type. There are also things like, these are magnets, but which are used to sort of lock the text in place before you print it. And hundreds of years ago, they used to have expandable pieces of metal called coins that you would turn a little screw and it would expand it to apply pressure. And so coining a phrase is sort of the last step you would take in the printing process before you actually put ink onto your type and start to print. So that's where coining a phrase comes from. There are quite a few others. If you'd like to know, just ask me after and I can regale you with stories about other printing expressions. Okay, so basically once you have all of your text set on the bed of the press, you would roll out some ink, and then you would use a roller to apply ink onto the top of the text. And then it's very much like what I just showed you. You would put your piece of paper down on top and then put it into a press and then apply pressure on the top. And that's basically the whole printing process. And so it was still very, very laborious, considering that it compared to the process that would have been involved in creating a manuscript. But the advantage of printing is really that once you have all of your type set on a page, you can then print 100 or 500 copies of the same page rather than having to write out an entire book by hand every time you want to make a copy of it. So because of that, that's really what led to the proliferation of books and to a stark increase in literacy rates all throughout Western Europe once printing was invented. Okay, so one of the things that people were really interested in learning about last time was how the illustrations in these books were created. So let's open this book up again. So as you can see, this book has an illustration in it. And this is what we call a woodcut. So there are three kinds of illustration processes that you generally find in books. What we call relief printing, Intaglio, and Planographic. So relief means that the white parts of the image are carved away from a piece of wood, and the black lines that are printed are the lines that are left on the surface of the piece of wood. So basically the illustration is standing up or is raised up in relief from the piece of wood. And so it again acts like a big stamp, and that's how you print it. So to give you an idea of how this is accomplished, this is a linocut. So basically it's linoleum that is mounted on a piece of wood, because linoleum is much easier to carve than wood is. And this is something that I made in a workshop a few years ago. But as you can see, it's the way that a woodcut would have been created is that you would have taken the flat side of a piece of wood and carved into it basically, and carved away the white space, and left the areas left on the surface of the wood are the parts that would be covered in ink and then printed. And one of the great advantages of woodcuts is that, as you can see, a piece of type is the same height as the woodcut. So you can print letters at the same time as you can print illustrations. So suddenly, once woodcuts were started to be used in book production, you could stick an illustration right in the middle of the page and have printing all around it. When we get to engravings, you'll see that it's basically impossible to have an engraving and text on the same page unless you print the page separately. But with woodcuts, you can actually print and have an illustration on the same page and print them at the same time, which was a huge advantage for printers at the time. Just make sure that I'm covering everything. You'll also see that this illustration is colored in. At this point, color printing had not been invented. And so if you see a book from this period and it's colored in, you know that it was colored in by hand, probably by an early owner of the book, which is pretty cool because, you know, we always love people who leave marks in books because it tells us something about how books were used over time. And so it's interesting to think that somebody potentially in the mid-15th century could have painted in or colored in this illustration. And it's particularly interesting in books like herbals, which are medieval sort of botany encyclopedias that indicate different kinds of plants and their medicinal uses and how to identify them and so forth. And so usually in the text, they would say, oh, the flowers are yellow and the leaves are green. But then people would go and color in the illustrations, which when you're thinking about a reference source makes a lot of sense because it's easier to just look at the illustration of the yellow flower and then to try to identify it in your garden rather than reading a bunch of text and trying to identify it that way. So anyway, so we know that this would have been colored in by hand. Okay, I'm going to jump over. Any questions about woodcuts before I move on? Anything in the chat?
There was a question in the chat about printing and the introduction of the printing press. Torsten asks, how large were early print runs?
From what I understand, not very large. Sort of between around 500, I would say. I don't think it would have been very common to even go up to 1,000. Because also keep in mind that at this stage, not many people would have been able to read books and most people wouldn't have been able to afford to buy them. So there was not a huge market for high volume. So it wouldn't really have been in the interest of the printer to print a huge amount. So I would say probably 500 would be the most somebody would be interested in. Then, oh, actually, I forgot. I was going to show you one of my favorite examples of woodcuts is in this book, which is by a man named Charles Estienne, and it's a medical history book about dissection. And this book was published in the, I can't remember the exact date, after 1543. So as you might know, Vesalius, sort of considered the father of modern anatomy, came out with his groundbreaking book, De Fabrica, in 1543. And this completely changed the way that everybody understood anatomy. It had beautifully detailed woodcuts demonstrating the dissection process and so forth. And so unfortunately for this guy, Estienne, he got into a legal case. He was sued basically by the illustrator who he had hired to create the illustrations for this book. And while they were in their legal battle, Vesalius's book came out and basically souped this guy and made his anatomical drawings irrelevant because Vesalius's were so far superior to his. But anyway,
Lauren came out in 1545.
45, thank you very much. But one of the things that I think is really interesting about these illustrations is this is long before copyright was really a concept that anyone was considering. And if you can see, I'm just going to zoom in a little bit here. Can you see that there's a very slight square that looks like it's almost cut out here? Can you see the white line that is running around this part of the illustration? So overall, this entire illustration was actually used in a book called For the Love of the Gods, which was a sort of licentious work about Greek gods creeping in through the windows of women at night and having their way with them. And it was illustrated using these woodcuts. But the illustrator of this medical work decided that, oh, well, you know, these woodcuts are already carved, so why don't I use them and just cut out this square in the middle? And so the illustrator of this work only had to carve this much of a new block, which he dropped into the existing block, and then printed it all at once, if that makes sense. So in this case, they're really just reusing other illustrations in order to create these anatomical drawings. So now let's move on to engravings. I will zoom out from here. Uh-oh, I think it might have frozen again. Yes. Sorry, everyone. I'm going to have to restart this program. Okay. Oh, no, now it's working. Sorry about, I'm not sure why it's glitching like that, but I'm just going to leave it. So as you can see, these are much more detailed drawings. These were done by a woman named Maria Sibylla Marion. She was somebody who lived in Amsterdam in the late 17th century. And she was always really interested in entomology at a time when, you know, women weren't really accepted as scientists. But she was really determined to continue to study bugs. She got married and was not happy being married. And the only way that she could get a divorce at this time was by joining a religious institution, becoming a nun, basically. And so she became a nun, got a divorce, and then managed to secure passage for herself and her teenage daughter on a boat from Amsterdam all the way to Suriname. And she spent 2 years in the jungle in Suriname studying insects and drawing them. And then after 2 years, she got malaria and got very sick and had to go back to Amsterdam. But I just think that this is such a fascinating story. That's a trip that would be hard for somebody to do alone today, let alone in the late 17th century. But basically, she was the first person to depict bugs next to the plants that they eat, and also the first person to document the metamorphosis process of butterflies. Anyway, so she grew up in a family of engravers, which I think gave her a real advantage. She was able to have a lot of control over the engraving process. And I will explain to you quickly how that works. Rather than carving into a piece of wood, with engravings, you would actually carve into a piece of metal, a flat piece of metal like copper. Usually it would be copper because copper is a fairly soft metal and it's easy to carve it away. So I'm just going to, hopefully the camera doesn't freak out. Here's an example of an engraved plate. You may recognize this building as a building on McGill's campus, if you can see it. Anyway, so this is mounted on a piece of wood, but hopefully you can see that it's a very thin piece of metal that has been mounted on the wood. And in order to create this kind of illustration, you would take these tools, something like this called a burin that has a little needle type thing on the end, and you'd actually carve away pieces of the metal. So when I mentioned that there were 3 kinds of illustration processes, this is an example of Intaglio, which means that if you start with a flat piece of metal and then you start to carve into it, the recesses in the metal are actually where the ink will settle, and that's going to be what prints. So basically, as you carve away pieces of the metal, you would then cover the entire plate in ink, and the ink would settle down into the recesses of the metal. And then you would cover the plate in a piece of paper and put it through a much, much more powerful press, using it with a big cylinder. And so you would slide it underneath a rotating cylinder, and it exerts so much force that the paper actually bites down into those grooves, and that's how the image is created. So as you can see here, because you're carving with a thin little knife into metal, you're able to get much, much finer detail in your drawing with an engraving than you would be able to with a woodcut. Is the flickering of the image really bothering people? Because I can restart the program if it is. Fergus, what do you think?
Doesn't seem too bad. It's
okay.
You know, it's happening, but it's pretty occasional.
I'm just going to try really quickly. Okay, this is much better, I think. So let me share my screen again. Okay, hopefully that's a bit. Yes. Okay, I realize that we're running out of time, so I'm just going to jump to one more illustration process, 1 or 2 more if we have time. Please do jump in if you have any questions at all. Should definitely mention lithography, because this also is a very important illustration technique. This book is the Zoology of the Voyage of the Beagle, so the famous voyage that Charles Darwin went on to the Galapagos and lots of other places, where they were documenting the animals that they encountered. This is where he saw his finches and so on. So as you can see here, this looks much more like a painting than anything we've seen before. The strokes are much more natural. It doesn't look like something that's been carved. It actually looks like something that's been drawn freehand. So the way that they were able to do this is an example of the planographic illustration techniques, so the third that I mentioned, where actually you're printing from the surface of, in this case, a stone. So in order to create a lithographic print, they would actually draw onto limestone. So this is a big hunk of limestone. The top of it is sanded down in order to become really, really smooth, almost mirror smooth. And this printing process operates on the principle of oil and water repelling each other. So basically, they would take something that was very oily, like a grease pencil, and draw onto the stone with this grease-based pencil. And then once the drawing is on the stone, they would put a little bit of nitric acid and gum arabic over the illustration to sort of etch it a little bit into the surface, but it's still very much on the surface of the stone. And then they would cover the entire stone in water, and then take a roller and roll ink over top of the illustration. And so the oil-based ink sticks to the greasy image, but is repelled in the rest of the area by the water that is covering the rest of the stone. So the ink only sticks to the image, and then once paper is laid over it and it's put through the press, only the greasy image is what's printed, if that makes sense. So basically, the big improvement of lithography over the other illustration techniques that we've seen is that it allowed artists to draw more freehand onto the surface of the stone rather than having to carve into something. And I think I have time to show you one last thing. Lithography wouldn't come around until the sort of very, very late 18th century, early 19th century. And one of the final illustration techniques that's important to know is wood engraving. So even though it's called engraving, it's actually a relief technique. But in this case, you would take the end grain of the wood and carve into the end grain, which they realized allows you to have much finer detail than you would have had in woodcuts that were carved into the flat side of the piece of wood. The person who really popularized this technique is Thomas Buick, and so this is one of Thomas Buick's works on bird. And as you can see here, this is actually a wood engraving that was done by Thomas Buick. We have a really great Buick collection here. We've got lots of his individually carved wood blocks. But in this case, they're all carved into the end grain of the wood, which is why the detail is so much finer than something like this, as you can see. So, and this block is actually what was used to print this illustration. Luckily, whoever initially owned these blocks put the volume number and the page number and everything on the back so you can actually match up the blocks to the illustrations they were used to print, which is really nice. And so we are almost out of time. Sorry, that was a very fast and furious jaunt through the history of illustration. But if anyone has any final questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. Anything?
I think I'm
So
going to, oh, there's a question.
Not really a question, but just sort of a statement that, so for all of these things were printed at sort of 1-to-1 size. Yes. Like what you see on the page is literally the illustration that somebody made.
Yes, absolutely.
And I just want to point out that I'm always blown away by how detailed they are, given that today quite often the illustrations are done much larger than is printed on the page and they're reduced so they look better. But the detail in these things is just amazing.
Yeah, it really is. And Torsten, I want to compliment you on the detail you put into this booklet. And this is actually the thank you gift that we give to all our STARS presenters. It's a booklet that was prepared a few years ago. Torsten was the main designer. Of course, it was a big team. And I will put this in internal mail. You should get it at 4th floor McGill Library. I'm pretty sure the mail room's still working. I don't know. Actually, I'd be really interested how long it takes them. So let me know when you get it, Lauren. I'll pop it in this afternoon. We have to thank Lauren for sure. So let's put our hands together with one of those quiet claps and show her how much we appreciate. We don't have much more time for questions, but if you're seriously burning, there's so many great things that we've learned. And thank you so much for pulling everything out and having it, sliding with your chair and bringing it under the dot camera. I think in 50 minutes, we've learned more about manuscripts and prints than we would have learned reading about an entire course. So I'm really appreciative. Are people invited to contact you if they have any? Yeah, all right. So by email is the best, I think.
Yeah, and my email and phone number are on the staff page for Rare Books, which you can just find by Googling McGill Rare Books. So please do get in touch if you have any questions. I'll be happy to answer them.
Thanks again, Lauren. Thanks to our help, Fergus, Grieve, Preeti Purba Singh, all the participants, the introduction by Chris Lyons, that's Lauren's boss who introduced her today. And in our participant gallery, you'll see Wayne Wood. He's the STARS speaker for November 11th. He'll be with you, same place, the Zoom platform for STARS. You do have to register in advance. Fergus set up the web form. Look for that on the faculty page, the Faculty of Science page. And then he'll send, once you've registered, he'll send you the Zoom link. Wayne is the Emeritus Director of McGill's Environmental Health and Safety Office. The title of his STARS on November 11th. My Life as a Decon Artist. Should we leave it there, Wayne, or is there anything you want to prepare us for?
No, I just wanted to thank you for inviting me, Ingrid, and the choice of date is fantastic because in my presentation, I'm going to mix quite a few links between some of the messes that I've cleaned up and McGill's wartime history on November 11th.
Well, thanks for that little bit of foreplay, I guess it is. Thanks, everybody. Have a nice rest of the afternoon. There you see the registration link. And again, Lauren, wonderful presentation. Bye, everybody. See you in a month.
Thanks so much. Goodbye.
Bye.